I'm a historian and freelance writer. My specialty is Western American history. And so when I got onto the history committee here at Trinity, I started doing a little bit of research into Peter Walcott's past. And when I realized that he had spent 6 years as a missionary to the Lakota people in the middle 1870s through the early 1880s, it started ringing all sorts of memory bells for me. And I realized that as a missionary, he had been in the Dakotas at some times that are connected to the history of the Sioux, also called the Lakota people, that resonates even to this day, if you've been keeping up with what's going on up at Standing Rock. It's all connected, and he was there. I have to say, when I first saw his picture and first read about his own description of his background, I was a little bit intimidated. He said he was lucky in that he got good schooling in Greek and Latin. It's Greek to me. And I looked at his picture and I thought he appears to be a classic high Victorian rector, and maybe out of central casting for a Masterpiece Theater program. But as I dug a little deeper, I realized that he had led an unusual life from the beginning. He was born in New York City, and he was born in 1856. His mother was very active in the church. His father was a businessman who was in the shipping business. And when the Civil War broke out, and that would have been when Peter was about 5, his father ended up involved with the Union Army on the Mississippi River, trying to continue his shipping business even through the Civil War, and taking part in the campaigns that opened up the Mississippi during the Civil War. So he was from a Union family. They lived in West Virginia. And I don't know if you know this, West Virginia became a state because the people in the western part of Virginia were Unionists. They wanted to stay with the Union. So West Virginia broke off during the Civil War and became its own state. They later moved to Memphis, Tennessee. And Walcott's father was involved in handling confiscated cotton from the southern states to be sold for the benefit of the Union. This makes you pretty unpopular in Memphis of the 1860s. So he describes that in his childhood he could remember Confederate raiders, cavalrymen charging up the road in front of their house. He could remember that right after the war, their family being threatened by the KKK. And these were formative to him. He combined with his mother's involvement in the church, he said that he wanted an adventurous life, but he wanted it to be related to the church. By the time he was 19, the family had moved to Iowa. His father started a farm there in Iowa, and when Peter was 19, he got in touch with the bishop of the Niobrara Missionary District and volunteered to go to Yankton, South Dakota, where he would work as a teacher in the mission for the Lakota people. Now I have to set the stage for his travel to the west. The Treaty of 1868, it's called the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, basically drew the map of the West that we're still dealing with today. A group of dignitaries came out from Washington. They met with and negotiated with the Lakota and Arapaho people. That right there is William Tecumseh Sherman. Fort Laramie is in eastern Wyoming, and so it's central to the Sioux country, their homeland. And tribal boundaries were agreed to, reservation boundaries were agreed to, and lands were set aside for the use of the Lakota And it was a classic, one of those, as long as the grass grows and the water flows kind of verbiage in the treaty. In the area that they set up, this was the Great Sioux Reservation. These are modern states superimposed over it, so you can get an idea of how big you're talking about. This is South Dakota, so the reservation takes up half of South Dakota. These unceded territories are areas that were set aside for the Lakota to use for hunting and for travel outside of the reservation. And they were not open to white settlement, and they were not supposed to even be traveled across without permission of the leadership of the Lakota people. This was what the map looked like in 1868. The states weren't all there, but this was Lakota country. This was a time of exploration. You had scientific groups going out all over the western United States and trying to figure out what the map really looked like. This is the Hayden expedition. They're alongside Yellowstone Lake. They took a photographer with them. And when they went back to Washington and presented Congress with photographs like this, which is Old Faithful, Congress set aside in 1862 the first national park in the world was Yellowstone National Park, 1872. This is another expedition that went out in 1874. It was led by this gentleman right here, who's George Armstrong Custer. He went into the Black Hills of South Dakota, basically in the area where, ironically, the Mount Rushmore is. And he took units of his cavalry regiment, he took scientists along, and on paper, he was trying to find an ideal place for a military post in the Black Hills. But in addition to the scientists, he also took miners. And he facilitated the miners finding gold in the Black Hills. That was a game changer. This is another photograph of that expedition in the Black Hills. So now, you notice that the reservation is shrinking. The proposals from Washington was Rapid City, the Black Hills are now knocked off of the Sioux Reservation, and there are proposals to have a proposed Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and here's Standing Rock, which is in the news today. Bishop William Hare recruited young Peter Walcott at age 19 to go to Yankton, South Dakota and become a teacher and secretary for the mission. And this is what Yankton looked like then. And these were the people they were dealing with. These are Lakota people who were at the Yankton reservation at the time that Walcott first arrived. And this is an example of what was called ledger art. Basically, paper was scarce, but Native Americans would take pages out of ledger books and do drawings. This is their illustration of what the Yankton mission looked like. So this is the Yankton Episcopal mission from Lakota eyes. Now, even though he was only 19 and was 20 before he left, Walcott realized that the key to communicating with these people was language. And so, having the supple mind of a 19-year-old, he learned Lakota. And said that he became pretty good at it. This is the Lord's Prayer. He worked as a teacher, and he realized that educating the kids was a way to be useful and meaningful to the Native people at the mission. And so he started his career as an educator. Now meanwhile, because of the Black Hills expedition that Custer led, there was a gold rush into the Black Hills, and this was before it was actually separated from the Lakota reservation. This was still Lakota land, and this was deadwood. The government And a recent article in the Smithsonian Magazine has found the paper trail and the smoking guns around us. The Grant administration, while publicly saying that they wanted no wars with the native people in the West, behind the scenes were trying to arrange for a confrontation that would justify sending the army in to force the Lakota onto a smaller reservation. They set up a situation where the Lakota were required to come into the reservation to be counted. Almost sounds biblical. But they made that pronouncement in the winter when the Lakota couldn't travel. And so at the end of the couple of months, they gave these people to travel into the main reservation. Those who were outside the reservation were declared hostiles. And the United States sent 3 different armies to fight them. One was defeated by the winter weather. One was the group that Custer was part of, and this is a Lakota representation of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And the third was defeated badly enough that they had to withdraw from the field like Rosebud. So basically the Lakota were winning. But eventually the army was able to grind down the Lakota resistance and force them onto the reservation. And the reason that they could do that is that a soldier takes a few weeks to train. A Lakota warrior takes a lifetime to create. And not only were the Lakotas having to fight the U.S. Army, but they were also having to live their lives. They were having to hunt for a living. They were having to tan hides, build teepees, all of these things so that they couldn't confront the U.S. Army as an equal military force. I'll back this up. An interesting point, Peter Walcott said that the native people at Yankton knew about the Little Bighorn fight 2 days before the telegraph came through that Custer had been defeated. And he said that there's some way, he said, is it flashing mirrors or smoke? He just didn't know. But the people where he was knew about the Little Bighorn fight before the American press knew about it. And that was clear across the width of Dakota. Walcott decided to go to New York. He was sponsored by Bishop Hare to go to the General Theological Seminary in New York, where he attended for 3 years and then was ordained a deacon. This is a place that was known as the Little Church Around the Corner, which he had a soft spot for, that's in downtown New York City. And then he returned to the Dakotas, where he volunteered to go to Pine Ridge. And this is a photograph of Pine Ridge at about the time that Walcott would have arrived as a freshly minted deacon. And the challenge was that most of the people on Pine Ridge had just come off the plains. They had been buffalo hunting the year before. And they were having to figure out how they were going to integrate into a culture that was dominated by rectangles rather than circles, is one way to look at it. The Native Americans often look at things as circular, and Europeans tend to look at things as rectangular. And I love this picture because of the teepee against the log cabin. Walcott commented that this was the wildest group of people that he'd ever run into, and that most of them didn't speak English, didn't want to speak English. They didn't wear European clothes, they weren't really interested in that. And that he had to gain the trust of these people and deal with those leaders who thought that there would be some advantage to dealing with the reservation and integrating into the European society. One of the people he dealt with was Red Cloud. This is American Horse. a man afraid of his horses. These are all people that Walcott mentions and had to work with. One particular friendship that grew up was with this man, and that is Bears the Sword was his name. And this is a picture of Bears the Sword with William F. Cody, who later was known as Buffalo Bill. And Walcott had a long conversation with Bears the Sword. Bears the Sword was going to be baptized. And he had some conflicts. He was involved with the Indian police, with the Lakota police. And he said, I might have to kill someone in that capacity. How do I justify being a Christian and serving in the police? And Walcott said, if what you're doing is right, it's not a contradiction. He talked you through that. And suggested that his baptized name could be George, because that was the warrior saint of England. And keep the name Sword. So this is George Sword. George Sword, the same person as an Indian policeman. Good friend of Peter Walcott's. Later, Sword became a deacon himself. And recently a book came out with some of his writings of Lakota stories written out in English. And there's a good chance that Walcott was the one who taught him how to sound out Lakota words using the English alphabet. Bishop Hare also sent Walcott into Deadwood to do some missionary work amongst the miners. Again, he's going into a wild situation. This is the Deadwood stage. And I love this, it's just packed. There's a bicycle on top. Walcott commented that at the time there were no railroads anywhere near to this area, that everything came and went from Deadwood by bull train, and this is a couple of wagons hitched to oxen. And that's what Deadwood looked like at about the time that Walcott was there. He said it was wall-to-wall bars and dance halls. And he was trying to organize the Episcopal community in that area. The Episcopal church that's there in Deadwood today says that it was an Episcopal service, was the first service ever held in Deadwood. And the situation was, in the 1870s, a person got killed by robbers, and they wanted to have a burial service, and someone had a book of prayer. And the person who read the service wasn't even Episcopal, they just happened to have an Episcopal book. It was a wild and crazy place. Probably not quite as wild and crazy as HBO would have you believe, but it was. Walcott went back to the East Coast to prepare for the priesthood. He did a retreat at St. John the Evangelist Mission in Boston. And then he went back to New York to visit with friends. And one of the things that he was interested in doing was meeting with various missionary societies to try to raise money for the church that they wanted to build in Pine Ridge. So he went to this mansion and met with the Ladies Missionary Society from Trinity Church in New York City. And the head of that group was Mrs. John Jacob Astor. And they asked him, what do you need out there in Pine Ridge? And he says, well, we could use linens. We don't have much of anything out there. And she said, linens? How much does it cost to build a church? And she wrote him a check. And so when he got back to Pine Ridge, they joked that he went out to New York and asked for purificators and came back with a church. He returned from New York and became a priest in Yankton in November, late November. And the next day he set out for Pine Ridge, and a snowstorm hit. He says that it was 3 days travel, and it got to 30 below. They had no tent. It was his guide, himself, and a couple of pack horses, and they made it through. And his comment was, except for a little bit of mild frostbite, we were okay. And something rang a bell about the timing of this storm, and it turns out, for those of you who are Laura Ingalls Wilder fans, it was the same winter and one of the same storms that she talks about in the Little House books. And De Smet is also in South Carolina.
It's an eastern side.
And in Pine Ridge, they built their church. This is, I know it says St. John's. The church was actually moved from Pine Ridge. But this, I believe, is the building that was the second church there in Pine Ridge, and they called it Holy Cross. And the records of Holy Cross Episcopal in Pine Ridge shows Peter Walcott celebrating Mass for the first time there in 1881. Remember that church, it'll appear again. It was moved over to Oglala, South Dakota, and then it has since been declared surplus by the Episcopal Church. We're not sure what's going to happen to it. At about this time, even though Walcott thought that he would spend a life in mission service, he found out that his parents were ailing, and they were back on the farm in Iowa. So he got permission from Bishop Hare to leave the missionary service and go to Oskaloosa, Iowa, where his parents were. And while there, he served as temporary rector in several parishes around that area so he could stay close to his parents. And along the way, he met his future wife, Eleanor Louise Smith, who was a native of Batavia, Illinois. But she had relatives down in the Oskaloosa area, so that's how they met. Eventually, because of his background in education out at Pine Ridge, in Davenport, the Episcopal Church wanted to start a boys' school. And this is Kemper Hall in Davenport. And Walcott was made the first headmaster, which he did for the next 7 years. This was starting in 1885, and he was headmaster there all the way up into 1892, when he decided he'd had enough of education and enough of boys' schools. And visiting the home of his wife in Batavia, he checked in with the bishop in the Chicago area, and that bishop said, "We have an opening at Trinity Church. You'd really like it there." And so in 1892, he became rector here and stayed until 1926. And so for 34 years he was rector here. Now in the meantime, I know this sounds like a bad novel, but back on the reservation, the Lakota people were trying to deal with the feeling that they were prisoners of war on the reservation, and that they really had no hope for their lives. By 1890, a new religion was sweeping the plains, and it was called the Ghost Dance religion. And it was a ritual religion, and the idea was that if you created special clothing and you danced a particular dance and danced it with enough fervor and faith, that European society would disappear, the buffalo would return in the herd sizes that they had been back in the old days, and that the Lakota people and other plains tribes could go back to their traditional ways of life. Now this was not a military move. These people were not warriors. This was a religious move where they were trying to dance the old days back rather than fight the old days back. But that made the Indian agents nervous to have hundreds, if not thousands, of dancing Indians who were dancing to make them disappear. So the Indian agents, especially at Pine Ridge, panicked and they called in the army. This is a battery of what are called Hotchkiss guns. They're small pack guns. They were, for their time, very modern, breech loading, rapid fire. They're small, but they're devastating. And it all came to a head of Wounded Knee. You've probably heard of Wounded Knee. It was a band of Lakota who gathered for a ghost dance who were confronted by the army, and the army opened fire on them. They killed well over 100 of the villagers, men, women, and children, using these cannon and rifle fire. And the wounded from Wounded Knee, the Lakota wounded, were taken to the Holy Cross Chapel, which was turned into a hospital. So this is the Episcopal Church at Pine Ridge, with the ground strewn with straw to make a makeshift hospital, and these are the survivors of Wounded Knee. Now, the United States government decided that the Lakotas who were involved in the ghost dance were dangerous people, so they arrested them. And they impounded them. Here's a picture of those people. And this picture was taken at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, just up the road. They were forced to live at Fort Sheridan for 3 years. And when I first looked at this picture, I thought these were teepees, and I thought that's interesting to let them bring their teepees, but no, they're actually Army Sibley tents. So they didn't let them bring their traditional housing. Now the government decided to give these people an out. They said, you don't have to stay at Camp Sheridan if you agree to travel with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. You can leave Camp Sheridan. The idea was that these people would tour with Buffalo Bill's show, which was headed to Europe, and they would see all the wonders of European society, and they'd realize that there was no point in resisting the cultural scheme of it. These are Buffalo Bill's Indian performers at Heidelberg Castle in 1892. So they left Illinois, they went on their grand tour of Europe, and they ended their tour at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So there's Buffalo Bill again and his Lakota performers ending their tour. Now, something that I'm fascinated with and can't prove one way or the other, the rector here at Trinity at that time spoke Lakota fluently. There were people just up the road who were Lakota. In 1893, the year after he became rector, down at the World's Fair, these people were performing. They were people he knew. I haven't found or tracked down Reverend Walcott's diary or any indication that he communicated with these people. But from what I learned about him, I would be surprised if he didn't. And I don't know, it's raising the hairs on the back of my neck that his mission to the Lakota people would continue even after he got here to Trinity. Now I asked myself, what would Reverend Walcott recognize in the current life of the Lakota people? And one of the things, these teepees are set up ceremonially at the Niobrara Convocation, which has been held annually since the 1870s. It was Bishop Hare's idea that the annual Sundance, which was a gathering time for the Lakota people, could be a model for an Episcopal gathering, which has gone on for well over 100 years. It happens every year. So Reverend Walcott attended several of these, and he would recognize that. He would probably be heartwarmed knowing that those people in Deadwood that he had worked with in 1880, a couple of years later, had built this church, which is still standing and being used every day. And he would recognize that the conflict that came from the Fort Laramie Treaty and the gold rush and the land grabs and all of that continues to this day. That 140 years is really not very long. This is the mass grave of the people killed at Wounded Knee. You've probably seen the historic photographs of the frozen bodies being thrown in the pit. I decided not to include that and instead show you what it looks like today. It's very real to these people. It's very real To us, this is the protest at Standing Rock, which is going on as we speak. It's another land use argument. And basically when the people of Bismarck, South Dakota, decided they didn't want a pipeline going through their backyard, take it over to the reservation, they won't care. The company building the pipeline started construction before they got any permission or permits from the Lakota people at Standing Rock. The Lakota people are concerned with water quality. They're concerned with the sheer arrogance of being told that they're going to have a pipeline across their property. And in the last week, it's turned to rubber bullets and fire hoses and biting dogs. I mean, it is Selma on the prairie. If you look at this, here's the Great Sioux Reservation of 1868. This area was taken after the Sioux War in 1877. Oddly enough, it includes the gold fields. Then nibbled away to where this is what remains of that huge area that I showed you on a map earlier. There's a fascinating TED Talk that you can find if you just do a Google search of Pine Ridge TED Talk. And there's a photographer who got his photographs published in National Geographic a couple of years ago. And he spent 5 years gathering those photographs, and it's a fascinating TED Talk. And he says that the only moral thing we can do is to give the 1868 treaty land back to Lakota and then not tell them what to do with it. But I doubt if that will happen. But there are certain foundational unfairnesses that come along with American history that we are not dealing with. And this is one of them. This is up there with slavery, Trail of Tears. This is something that has not been dealt with. And I'd be curious what Reverend Walcott would say about that. It's interesting as far as the Episcopal missionary work on the Lakota reservation, they were hugely successful. They had thousands of converts. And there's a strong presence of Episcopal people on the reservation to this day. So the chances are those folks at Standing Rock are getting hosed down and threatened by dogs. A lot of them are Episcopals.
That's a good question about that.
Hang on just a second. And I want to read you something that he wrote in his reminiscences about his time as a missionary. He says, "I am grateful for the home and school influences which developed my vocation for my life work, and grateful for the early years which I spent among the Indians in the West, amid surroundings stranger and more foreign to our accustomed ways than is often found even in the foreign mission field today. I regard these missionary years as the best possible preparation for a fruitful ministry. And I wish that every young clergyman, before he settles down into the routine of a well-ordered parish, might have a similar experience. Too many young men, upon leaving the seminary, seek soft berths and good stipends, and never have any experience of the roughness of the frontier or the hard and exacting work of a mission station, whether in the city slums, the mountains, or backwoods, or in the farm field, where they must of necessity learn to make their tools before they can use them. Many a promising career has been spoiled by the softness which a comfortable curacy or an independent rectorship engenders in one whose character has not been strengthened by hard work and plain living. I believe that every bishop should, so far as possible, require of his young clergy that they should devote the early years of their ministry to hard missionary work, and so develop and prove their fitness for parochial responsibilities." And if that resonates with you, this is an advertisement I found online. It went up just a few days ago. We are looking for full-time superintending presbyter who would work with the 3 part-time priests and together serve 8 small congregations scattered around the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. That photograph is the latest of the Holy Cross chapels, the one that Walcott helped found. So,
Well, I'm curious to know, you mentioned the Episcopal missionary work that was ongoing. Was there any, what if any complicity was there at the Episcopal missions and perhaps the Walcott in the forced assimilation of Indian peoples to European culture?
that's hard to say from what Walcott himself wrote, except that he simmered over Wounded Knee. He called it a disgraceful affair. I think that many people in the 19th century who were involved in missionary or government work felt they had Native American best interests at their heart to simply prevent them from dying out. And they thought they were doing the right thing by saving their lives. And part of that would be converting them to farming or converting them to Christianity. I think that they believed that that was a noble thing to do. I think with our 2020 hindsight glasses, we can see that differently. And like I say, it's one of those knotty questions.
You see movies.
I don't think they were complicit. I think often the missionaries, and you get into the argument about missionary work in the first place. When a missionary arrives in your village, he's there to change you to a different religion. And culture, in this case. But over the years, I've worked for the National Park Service several times, at Fort Union in New Mexico and Fort Larned in Kansas, and been involved with Fort Laramie as a historic site. And it's one of the great ironies that the people who knew the Native Americans the best were the ones who realized what a train wreck the government was allowing and what a travesty. Some of the soldiers complained that in 1873 they were going into the Black Hills and finding miners' shacks and burning them and driving the miners out at gunpoint. And then in 1875 and 6 they were fighting the Lakota to allow the miners to come into the Black Hills. I had a friend who served in Vietnam and was also a historian with the Park Service, and he said that what drew him to the Indian Wars period was the common soldier. His experience reminded him of his service in Vietnam and Laos. Is basically the politics are run amok and we're just being told what to do. I wish I had an answer. I didn't see any hesitation that Walcott had that teaching Lakota children English and trying to reach out to the Lakota population was wrong. And I think he felt like he was helping. I think Bishop Hare felt the same way. And I saw no sign that he was rooting for the miners or rooting for the land grabs. Yes?
Scott, was the Diocese of Chicago the farthest west diocese at that time in the country?
I don't know that. I know that Bishop Hare ran the Niobrara Missionary District, so that's all I know. I would be kind of surprised that St. Louis wasn't the diocese, unless it was under Chicago. My focus here was really limited. I think it's interesting that Reverend Walcott kept talking about his time in the West when Yankton and Pine Ridge are really not that far west, at least compared to the march of history and all the way out to California.
How large mission was here? How large was the church when the Reverend was raised here?
It's interesting. There's a record of their first service, and it was very small. And their offering was, I think it was $1.40, which for the time and the place was probably pretty impressive, hard to catch.
That's when the church was wooden.
Log.
Or log. It was well before the brick church.
Right. Nowadays, it's interesting when you go online, the Episcopals on the Pine Ridge Reservation are in a continuing argument that the Diocese of South Dakota is strapped for money, and they're closing small churches, and they're struggling to keep small churches open. The problem is that the distances are so great, and it's if you lose your small parish church, even though you may have a dozen people there, it could be a 50-mile drive on marginal roads to get to another church.
And was this called Highland Park at that time?
I'm sorry?
Was this called Highland Park?
At the time that, in 1892, when Walcott became rector here, it was certainly Highland Park. And
Did he die here?
he did in 1831, if I remember right. Pardon me, 1931, I was on the right century. He died before he was born. His reminiscences of his time here are very warm. And his belief was that a rector should be involved in the community. He was involved in the local library district. He was involved with the Presbyterian Church up the street and other churches here in Highland Park. And I found this interesting because there's an echo in it of a complaint that I've heard from modern rectors. He said, you know, it's getting to the point where I spend all my time on administration and none of my time on ministry. And he's just kind of grousing about that. I want more time to get out there and take the word of God into the streets. But here I am counting beans. And the fact that he at first awed me by knowing Latin and Greek, he admits later in his reminiscences that he was really not a numbers guy. I thought, good. Yes.
Kind of as an aside, that I had a pleasure meeting with Russell Means, Dennis Banks, both who grew up on a little bit reservation, kind of led the challenge of work. And their attitude was that while they were missionaries, that they were complicit in trying to change the Indian culture and religion and so forth. And so he was not in favor of Christian missionaries. It was kind of on the militant side. But it was quite interesting to hear in detail how they talked about their culture and belief and the whole attitude of the Europeans and their lies and cheats and so forth. And they became the militant wing of the Dakotas.
And then in 73, Wounded Knee.
Yes.
The occupation there. That was the beginning of the modern Native American.
Movement, yeah. Well, it started off as AIM in Cleveland, American Indian movement, and then became the next one.
Well, it's absolutely true that the missionaries were cultural imperialists.
Yeah.
And there's no way around it.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, even people who've gotten a pretty bad reputation from history, people like Kit Carson, who was an Indian agent at one point, he was begging Washington to honor the treaties they'd signed in the 1850s. He was saying, you are not sending the annuities that you promised these people, and yet you are preventing them from the hunting lifestyle that keeps them alive. He says, if you do not feed these people, you will have to fight these people because they're not going to starve quietly. And again, that is kind of the cycle.
And the treaties with the tribes were as valid, should have been as valid as treaty with European or any other foreign nation, but was not treated that way at all.
Exactly, and there. You can look at that map and chuckle, but it really is, that's what the treaty says. In 1980, the Supreme Court heard the case that the Lakota people had against the United States government about the fact that the Black Hills were taken from them and never actually paid for. And the Supreme Court decided in the Lakota favor. And so, I've forgotten the exact number, it was in the millions of dollars were offered the Lakota to pay for the Black Hills in 1980 to call it even. And the Lakota, and I actually, this is something that's admirable, they said no. no, we're not taking this money because that means we're accepting this land theft. And so that money was put in trust and now accounts for over $2 billion. What's interesting is if you take a calculator and you divide $2 billion by the number of Lakota people there are, it would amount to about $15,000 or $20,000 apiece for the land that was taken from them. So I think that confronting some of these foundational issues with American history means struggling to look at a map like that and actually consider giving that land back, or figuring out what can we do to protect it. And Russell Means came to Fort Laramie. I wasn't actually there that day. And he gave a speech where he said, and this park stands on Lakota land. And the park superintendent kind of whispered to him after the speech, no, actually, Lakota land ends at the Platte River. So we're not on Lakota land. But if you go a mile that way, you're on Lakota land. It's history, and there are a lot of oxes gored. I don't know how you make it right. Yeah.
Does Reverend Walcott have descendants? Did he have children?
I do not know this.
It'd be interesting to
It'd be neat to
try and
track down his
get in
diaries.
touch
if you
with
have.
any of his.
And I could find no photographs of him working on Pine Ridge. But then Pine Ridge was so far out there at that time, it was rare that they had photographers. And some of the photographs I had to use actually came from a few years after the period that he was there. Any other questions?